Hello everyone, my name is Jeff Miesbauer, Content Manager at Agiloft. Welcome to today's training webinar titled Using and Modifying the Contract Types Table, presented by Agiloft Implementer Damian Kemp. As part 2 of our series on the Contract Types Table, today we'll discuss the more advanced concepts of using and modifying the contract types in Agiloft, as well as how to leverage this versatile table to streamline your system and bring more visibility to your contract process. Presentation will be about 32 minutes, followed by a live Q&A with Damian. Please submit your questions in the appropriate window in the Zoom platform at any time during the presentation. It takes us about a minute to queue up the video, so please bear with us as we do that.
Hi, I'm Damian, and I'm going to be talking to you about advanced contract classification in Agiloft. Specifically, some ideas on how to make the best use of the contract types table to structure and manage contract metadata. I'm going to assume that you're familiar with the contract types table in Agiloft's out-of-the-box system, but I'll take a brief look at that table first for inspiration on how to expand it into a more powerful classification system. Our broad understanding of contract types will give us some ideas about the ways we can build onto this table. Specifically, we know it's a table that holds these groupings of contracts called contract types. We know there are controls in it, like extra fields to show, and we know it's connected to some other tables. From there, we'll branch out to explore new possibilities, adding a simple table to expand our classification structure, adding flag fields beyond extra fields to show, and using links to filter what choices are available for different contract types. In each case, we'll run through the process of adding in some of these classification elements, and we'll see how they can be used in a CLM system, and we'll reserve some time at the end for questions as well. In the out-of-the-box system, each contract type serves several functions. One of these is simply to act as a bucket, a grouping of one kind of contract. Contract types can also act as a control panel for the contracts linked to that type, holding choice field values that control fields within the contract itself. The clearest example of this is extra fields to show, which I mentioned in the last slide. You can find this field in contracts as a link called contract types extra fields to show, and it controls the visibility of contract fields. By changing which fields are listed under the extra fields to show in a contract type, the visibility of those fields can be changed in all contracts of that type. Last, contract types serve as a switchboard, a way to quickly link contracts within that type to several other background tables at once, such as a few specific print templates and approval workflows. Just as a reminder, we'll run through these functions in the out-of-the-box contract lifecycle management system. I just want to point out, for instance, that we have this contract type called service contract, which contracts link to it as a bucket. Their field visibilities defer to the choices selected for it in extra fields to show, and they use its links to print templates and approval workflows. So how can we customize this? Since the bucket aspect of contract types is the simplest, the easiest way to add to our existing contract classification system is to create additional tables to act as additional layers in the contract hierarchy, such as a small contract categories table, where each contract type is associated with a contract category record with minimal fields, acting simply as a larger grouping of multiple contract types. So how would we create this table? Let's take a look. I'm going to Setup, clicking Tables. I make sure the table tree is selected, and I click New. Give it a label and a plural label, as well as an internal name. Ignore the rest of this tab. On the Graphics tab, pick an unused icon. Ignore the rest. On the Action Bar tab, we want to create an action bar so that some controls appear above the table view. We'll add the bare bones: New, Delete, View, and Search, with a separator in the middle. On the Left Pane tab, click to add it to the left panes managed by admins, and I'll notify users too. That lets them automatically add this table to their left panes even if they've already customized them. Over on the Permissions tab, we probably want more people than just admins to be able to work with this table. I'm going to allow contract managers to do all these things as well. And I'll allow most groups to view own and view others contract categories too. Once we've done that, we'll just need to add a few fields to finish these buckets and link in contract types. I'm going to cancel out because, as you may have noticed, I actually already created this new table called contract categories. I've given it a new text field, told the names of these categories, and I've even included a link to it in contract types, and a related table back in contract categories, so we can see the contract types that are linked to it. It really doesn't have anything else, though. It's currently just a bucket. My advice, keep it that way. You absolutely can start putting overarching controls in these contract categories, but honestly that just means you have two different control panels to look through whenever you want to change anything. It's generally going to be easier to keep those controls in a single table, contract types. As a final touch, I've added a link to contract categories from contracts. And I've set the existing link to contract types so that it's filtered to only show those within the currently selected category. So that's an additional layer of contract hierarchy. Next, I want to look at the control panel aspect of our contract classification system. Most folks using the contract types table are vaguely familiar with extra fields to show. They know the fields listed there, like contract amount, somehow show up in the contracts of that type. It looks like extra fields to show tells contract amount to hide or show itself. But really, this is an example of conditional visibility in the field that's hiding or showing up. Contract amount controls its own visibility based on the extra fields to show selection brought in from the contract type, and it could just as easily base that conditional visibility on any choice field. In fact, the ability to edit the field can be set to be conditional on a choice field as well, and that choice field can be kept in the contract type. So the next customization we're going to look at is to add more of these controls. What if we want some contract types to always require legal review? You know how you can create companies directly from within a contract? What if users could only create new companies from within certain contract types? What if we wanted to have up to 3 countersigners depending on the contract type? What if certain contract types prevent most users from seeing attachments unless they're the requester? It's common to restrict access to such contract types individually in permissions. Contract requester group can view others' contract attachments if contract type does not equal employment agreement, or medical services agreement, or it can get complicated. But if we have multiple restricted contract types, We could do the same thing with a single restriction level flag field. All these things can be accomplished with the use of choice fields built into the contract type. Let's take a look at restricted contract types. Like I said, this is going to be a choice field. Sometimes we call this a flag field. We start by going to Setup Contract Types and clicking the Fields tab. I select New and Choice Field. I name it, create a new choice list for it. Clicking on Create brings up an open box to add choices to. Each line is a choice. Editing the choice list shows them as separate objects, more like records, with an edit icon. Just keep in mind that if you ever want to delete a choice from the list, any records that have that choice selected will suddenly have no choice selected, so you may want to move them to a different choice first. But for now, we're just setting up our initial options: restricted and unrestricted. With my new choice list in place, I'll set the default to unrestricted. I copy permissions from the contract category field. Now I need to add this new field to the linked set from contracts to contract types, and then pull it through in the linked set from attachments to contracts. After this field is added to the linked set in contracts, I'll add it to the linked set in attachments. It may seem weird to create a link to a link, but we actually end up doing this fairly often in Agiloft. We want to be able to point to a record specific to another record. In this case, from within a contract's attachment, we're pointing at the contract type specific to the parent contract of that attachment. That means a double link. From attachment through contract to contract type. Now that both links are in place, my last step is setting up the permissions dependent on the flag field. I go to Setup, Access, Groups. This is where user permissions are determined. I'll modify the permissions of the contract requester group. In the Tables tab, I look for the attachment table. Under Record Permissions, I'm going to leave View Their Own Attachments at All. These users will be able to see their own attachments, even on a restricted contract. But under View Other People's Attachments, I'm going to set it to a new saved search. Contract restriction level is unrestricted. they can only see other people's unrestricted attachments. I'm finished. Note that I could set up a similar filter for this group with other tables, such as the contract record as a whole, or for other groups, and the process would be the same. Now let's look at another example. What if we want to have fields for up to 3 countersigners, and we want those fields to show up if a field in contract types called number of countersigners is set to the right selection? Notice that this will have to be a choice field, since conditional visibility can only be based on a choice field. We might be tempted to create, say, an integer field for the number of countersigners, but we have to use a choice field in order to use conditional visibility. So where do we start? We'll have to get all 3 signer links set up in contracts, and we also need to create that control field, number of countersigners. The links are going to base their visibility on that control field, so let's start by creating that. And we're building all of our control fields in contract types. Okay, so I'm going to go to Setup Contract Types and click the Fields tab. I've actually already created the number of countersigners choice field along with a new choice list specifically for this field. I've selected different numbers for each contract type, and I've added it to the linked set in contracts. Next, in contracts, I set up the signer fields with conditional visibility. Looking at the linked sets for first-party signer and second-party signer, I create a linked set for third-party signer. As you can see, I've already done this, but I'll run through the process because creating a linked set is a bit complex. This is a new link to selected fields. The table is person, mapping looks good. We call this a non-MVE strict link since it doesn't have multiple values enabled and we're not allowing any entries that are not in the source table. In the Fields tab, we add the same fields we saw in the other linked sets: email, full name, ID, and title. And we can copy their permissions easily. The options setup was simple in the other linked sets, but they did have a restriction in place. Empty person company ID matches contract company ID and not empty. Okay, so we'll include that. Set the fields to display however you prefer. I generally pick 1 or 2 to be hyperlinked box with lookup or simply auto, and set the rest to some form of view only. Once this new link is in place, I can think about conditional visibility, located in each linked set in the Options tab. When should the third-party signer fields show up? when contract type number of countersigners equals 3. When should the second party signer fields show up? When contract type number of countersigners equals either 2 or 3. First party signer will always show up, so we can skip it. Remember to add the new linked set to the power user and end user layouts. Now, depending on how many countersigners our contract types have, those contracts will show spots for that number of countersigners. We could go even further and set up different e-signature actions for each of these contingencies as well, but at that point we may want to use the more dynamic e-signature workflow setup that we saw in the webinar on multiple contract party solutions. Also, make sure to check out our upcoming webinar on using e-signature. But this example is great if you have a set number of countersigners for each contract type. So what else can we do with contract types? We've seen how we can supplement them with contract categories and enhance their control over contracts using additional choice fields. How do we make greater use of their switchboard aspect? Currently, they link to approval workflows and print templates. Approval workflows let each contract type have different sets of approvals available to it, while linking to print templates allows each type to generate different kinds of documents. What else can contract types link to as a useful shortcut? What if we had specific departments or internal entities that were available for each contract type? Or what if we filtered our counterparty locations by country, only allowing specific countries for each type? We could have sets of approvers available for each one, or a default internal contract owner. Each of these options would use a new linked set created in contract types that then gets pulled into the link in the contracts table. Let's look at what a filter on departments would look like. First of all, what kind of field are we creating? It's got to be a link, right? So here we have some choices to make. Remember multiple value enabled links? You can link to multiple records at the same time. So we could create an MVE link from contract types to the various departments that we want to be available in those contracts. But because I want to be able to filter the departments within contracts later, it makes more sense to go the other way around, just like print templates and approval workflows. More on that later. But let's look at how those two are set up in contract types. In each case, there's a link to the default choice, but the main link is actually in the other table, whether it be print templates or approval workflows. So how do contract types show all those print templates and approval workflows that are linked to it? With a related table. So we link from departments to contract types and then create a related table in contract types of all the departments linked to it. Going to Setup Departments and the Fields tab, I create a new link. Should this be a link to single or a link to selected fields? There's some room here. Either choice is reasonable, and Print Templates uses a link to selected, while Approval Workflows uses a link to single. Let's go with a link to selected. We link to contract types. In this particular case, we'll actually enable multiple values. When doing so, we almost always use the fast search option, and notice that we probably shouldn't allow random entries not in the source table. We want our users to select a contract type, not just write in the word marmalade. Again, we refer to a link that doesn't allow random entries as a strict link. Also worth noting is that once we create this field, we cannot change the MVE setting. We'll bring in the contract type itself, and the ID field, and the status. I'll start by copying the permissions from the department head field, but I'll let contract managers edit the contract types associated with any department record. I don't need any particular default selection or other special options. This will end up appearing as an embedded table, so I'll take off the field label because it'll look weird, and left justify this table. I add it to the layout, along with a text header instead of the label, and I hit finish. Now I can already make some selections. I'll give a few options to HR, and everything but employment agreements to the finance department. Notice that the benefit to a selected field's MVE link is that you get multiple pieces of information, whereas the main drawback is that you have to display it in this big old table. A link to single would give you just a single piece of information, but it would look a little bit more compact. Next, I'm going to add this link as a related table in the contract types. I select the link and copy permissions from the contract category link. I'll display it using a really small view, like mobile. Again, instead of showing the label, I'll left justify it and add a text header to the layout along with the table. At this point, I should probably rename this tab. Perfect. And as you can see, my choices show up correctly. I can also modify and add links from this end using the magnifying glass and the unlink button. As a final step, in the contracts table, I'm going to add a filter to the department link. Recall that filters are on the Options tab. I want to restrict the departments we can choose from to only those departments whose contract types include the contract type of this particular contract. In other words, I want the department's contract types to overlap with the contract type of this record, the parent record of the linked field. So I look in parent fields for contract type. I could have also used fully contains here, but that's a string search, so I tend to prefer overlaps with items in. I'll name it and save the search. Now if I go to create a new contract, my department choices will change based on which contract type I've selected. Great. To review, today we went through the roles that the contract types table currently plays, and for each one we explored how we can enhance the table's capabilities. We walked through the addition of a contract categories table that acts as a way of grouping contract types into larger buckets. We looked at extra fields to show and how to create other choice fields in contract types that can control contract field visibility in a similar way as part of a powerful control panel. And we looked at how we can link out from the contract types switchboard to other tables like departments, as a shortcut or to limit the choices in different contracts. We really dived deep today, and I know that was a lot of information. Thank you for joining me and taking a look at some of the possibilities for leveraging the contract types table in your Agiloft system.
All right. So now we want to open it up for Q&A with Damian. I'll start with the one that we always get. Yes, this recording will be available, and we will email you a link to the recording within 24 to 48 hours. So be on the lookout for that. And yeah, I just want to say I appreciate the feedback here on the video quality and the audio. We're working to improve these, and just as a heads up, if it was distracting or you couldn't focus, the replay that we send out will be clearer. We'll edit that down a little bit, so hopefully that'll be helpful to you after this. We've got a few questions coming in. One from Dara. Will the department limitations for what can appear for contract type with the department limitations for what can appear for contract type, is there a way to make this limited list show for the sales team selection? But if the admin receives the request, they would have the ability to change the request to a different contract type, even if not in the sales list. Damian, I don't know if you've had a chance to read this one. In our company, admins equals the first reviewer in legal.
And so the way that I built it for the video, it could not change it to be different for different people like that. But you could make it more complicated. You probably have to add two different fields, one that sales is filling out and one that the admins are filling out, and then that end up kind of doing the same thing in the background, but the admin one just has more options. But the short answer is you could do it, but you'd have to build it out in a more complicated way.
Oh, okay, great. Brenda asks, is there a way to add a table within an existing template and rename it as a new template?
Right. So this I'm thinking because we were adding a department table within a contract type. I assume that's what we're talking about, like adding adding a table like the departments table, or actually it was the other way around. Sorry, adding a table like the contract types table to to a department and renaming it as a new department. So if that's what we're talking about, let's see, actual table. Okay, so so the template is in the print template to generate a document.
Yes.
Gotcha. Right.
Okay.
So so adding tables to print template is often done with related tables, and I showed some related tables today. And you can absolutely copy print templates and say, I want this print template except with a new related table in it, and that's you would simply download the existing print template, edit it, and then in fact I think you can copy it through directly through the interface, and then you'd edit it to add the related table formula, which would just be $ formula parentheses. I don't know how familiar with print templates you are, but it's $ formula parentheses, and then the code for the related table, which you find in the contract fields tab. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Great. Yeah, great question, Brenda.
Yeah.
I see another one here. Is there a reason to create a contract categories table above contract types instead of a contract subtypes table under contract types?
Right. So so in this case, we created the contract categories over contract types. What I recommend is that the lowest level should have the kind of complexity and automation, and the complexity in the out-of-the-box system is built into contract types. So it's way easier to keep that as the lowest level, but you can rename it. So if people want to have contract subtypes, what I usually recommend is that they simply rename contract types to be contract subtypes, just give it a new label, and then create a new table over it that's much simpler, like we created the contract categories, except you could easily name it contract types now that you've renamed that to subtypes.
So you said when you're setting up a bunch of linked fields, you make most of them view only, and only a couple that you can change. Why? I mean, why'd you do that?
Right. Yeah. So those bunches of linked fields, we call that a linked set. Those links in that linked set are all pointing to the same record. So we can say that they all are kind of a way of selecting the record. Each link can be a way of selecting the record, but sometimes that's confusing. So for instance, if you're linking to a requester and the requester's manager, that's all linked to the requester. It's just that the requester record shows their manager. So if you make the manager link look like it's a way of selecting the record, it's still going to select the requester, but it can be a little misleading because it looks like you're selecting the manager. So I try to keep the links that aren't really representing the record as view only, and the ones like one or two links that are representing the record, like its name or its ID, to be the ones that you can actually change with the drop down from the box or the auto or whatever changeable options for those fields.
Oh, okay. I think that makes sense.
Cool.
Another one here. Is it possible to make the restricted contract functionality more specific with more options?
Right. Yeah. So I just created a choice list for restriction level that had two choices. It was restricted and unrestricted. But the reason I didn't make it a checkbox is with the idea that you could add more choices to that choice list. So if you want to make a semi-restricted option or something, you can totally add that. I would add the caveat that anytime you add to that, it is going to make your group permissions more complex when you go in and say, okay, so-and-so, this group can see and edit semi-restricted contracts that aren't theirs, but they can't see or edit restricted contracts, and this other group can only do unrestricted. So it's going to make it more complex to create in the first place, to create those permissions. And something that's often overlooked that I want to really be clear, it makes maintaining those going forward, it makes that process more complex.
Great. So last question here for our admins here on the training, where can they go to get more information, learn more about the contract types table, or maybe other tables related to that?
Right. So we love our wiki. I will paste a link to the contract types table wiki article in the chat. That's kind of very, very specific to what we've been talking about. But from there, you can search our wiki for articles on everything. We're constantly updating it, and we've got a ton of articles on there on every topic related to Agiloft. So please take a look at our wiki. It's a fantastic resource.
Great. Yeah, and I'll just add to that, if you have specific questions, feel free to go to the online community.agiloft.com. You can pose questions there. Or feel free to just email us at news@agiloft.com. If you have any questions related to this training or other trainings, we'll be happy to answer them or send them to Damian so he can provide his expert advice there. But yeah, thanks again to Damian for your time with this training. I think it was an informative one. We got some good questions out of it. So thanks for that. And just a reminder, if you've enjoyed this one, check out our full webinar series on our website at agiloft.com. Next week on the 17th, we'll do another training on configuring import-export in Agiloft, and this will be a good one. Yeah, thank you, Diane. Yeah, we appreciate your feedback here. So just thanks again, and we'll see you next week.